Well, good afternoon. Our topic today that we're going to be talking about, the heat is on, the South China Sea and the Senkaku Islands, island disputes. And with us in the studio as our special guest, Mr. Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum CSIS. And Brad, glad to have you in the quarterback position here.
Certainly in the middle. I'm not sure if I'm quarterback, but thanks for having me back, David. It's good to be back to our listeners. Thank you for joining us, and Happy New Year.
And as the wingman for this show, Mr. Carl Baker, the Director of Programs for Pacific Forum.
A wingman.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything about that, but
it's good. That's good. Well, let's kind of start off this discussion a little bit about Carl. Where are we with respect to recent developments involving the East Sea disputes, the Senkaku Islands between China and Japan? What's new there?
Well, what's new in the Senkakus, of course, is that we have almost daily interactions between Chinese maritime or marine surveillance ships and Japanese Coast Guard ships. And we've also had some interactions with surveillance planes from China and fighter jets from Japan, and just in the past week, Japanese fighter jets responding or Chinese fighter jets responding to Japanese fighter jets. So certainly the tensions are there. They are increasing the visibility of military assets at this point, and there doesn't seem to be any backing down from either side in terms of posturing, trying to claim control, or at least perceived control, of the maritime space around those islands.
Let's move south and talk about developments involving the Philippines and China with respect to their territorial disputes.
Yeah, you know, South China Sea, of course, there's several disputants, but the Philippines has been the most vocal and the most active in resisting Chinese claims to those islands. And you know, ever since last year, when the Chinese blocked off an area called Scarborough Shoal, which is fairly close to the coastline of the Philippines, they've continued to block Philippine fishermen from entering into what is essentially an atoll fishing area. And so the Philippines has tried, and they've made advances, diplomatic advances to China, and in the last week they have said, we've given up, we can't make any progress, and so we're going to take it to an arbitration tribunal at the UN, which is operated under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so they've taken it to this tribunal in an attempt to get a judgment from the tribunal on the Chinese claim to what is referred to as the 9-dash line, which includes basically all the water in South China Sea.
Has China accepted jurisdiction of the tribunal?
Well, no. In fact, when China signed UNCLOS in 2005, or 2006, I'm sorry, it in fact put in a clause that said it did not accept any of the proceedings from any of the tribunals at UNCLOS, or at the international law.
So the ramifications of that are the Philippines are going through an exercise in what, futility, or?
Well, perhaps. I mean, that's
lawyer,
certainly,
David, you're supposed to know the answers to these questions.
That certainly is the judgment of the analysts that have looked at it. Is they've said that it's unlikely that they'll get a judgment back from the tribunal, and there's a couple reasons why that's probably the case. I mean, first and foremost, because China has said they won't accept the outcome. But even beyond that, the fact is that any tribunal that would make a judgment won't be able to make a judgment on territorial claims, because the tribunal itself says it will not address sovereignty claims. So it can't address sovereignty claims. And second is,
and what does it address?
Well, it addresses disputes that
don't involve sovereignty.
That don't involve sovereignty. and so the other problem is that the islands themselves have not, the determination of the islands themselves has not been made, whether they're islands or rocks. If they're islands, they have actual territory associated with that island, because under UNCLOS, land dominates water, which simply means that if you have an island, it has a maritime territorial space associated with it.
Okay, hold on a second. So our listeners are not confused with this. What Mr. Baker is talking about is the way that dirt and rocks sticking up out of the water are classified under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Right.
And so there are three separate classifications, correct? One is for an island. The second is for some type of land feature.
Well, no, I mean, it's basically either an island or a rock.
Okay.
And if it's an island, then it has an associated territory with it. If it's a rock, it has no territory associated with it. Now, the third feature is that some islands have what is called a continental shelf associated with it. And so if that's the case, then it actually has an economic zone associated with it, which extends out 200 miles. So the territorial claim can be 12 miles. And I suspect that if they did make the judgment on the biggest land features in the South China Sea, it would be a 12-mile territorial claim that you could make around that island.
Okay.
So can the tribunal, this is fascinating, I'm learning something here. Can the tribunal, as part of its scope, make a determination regarding whether this is a rock or an island? In other words, is that with it?
No, that's why the tribunal is not going to be able to make a judgment, because that is left to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which can only operate based on mutual consent from the
Each
different
party
parties.
Participating. Right. That part I knew. But so I would just assume that if this wasn't a sovereignty dispute, that it was a definitional question and therefore might fall under its jurisdictional grounds.
Right.
But no?
No.
Excellent assumption, but wrong.
Wouldn't be the first time.
Okay. One other development that has occurred, maybe not in the last couple of weeks, but certainly recently.
Before you go though,
Okay.
I want to parse this for a minute. Okay, the Philippines knows that it's between a rock and a hard place. What is the advantage and what's to be gained by going to saying that you're prepared to go to a tribunal when you know that your adversary, opponent, other party isn't going to?
Well, yeah, and I think the answer is they're completely frustrated with the diplomatic process, the bilateral diplomatic process, number one. But number two, what I think they hope to achieve is to get some sort of judgment from the tribunal on the validity of the 9-dash line, because that's really what is troubling to the Philippines and to everyone else, because China continues to claim the 9-dash line, but it refuses to define what that 9-dash line means and its precise limits. So it has never given.
And the tribunal can make that determination.
Well, it can certainly make the determination that the 9-dash line is not consistent with the allowances in UNCLOS for coastlines and continental shelf
Okay,
baselines.
guys, before we get down in the weeds.
No, but wait, actually, I want to elevate this a little bit.
All right,
because
well, make sure you're elevating.
We're standing on rocks, and I want to know, because we're moving from rocks to principles. And so my question is, and sort of what I was getting at was, it strikes me that essentially what we're looking at is a judicial process that at the end of the day accomplishes nothing.
What?
So wait. So my question is, to what degree, is there a moral high ground standing on a rock or a feature? Or
Yeah,
where does that get us?
the moral high ground for the Philippines is that it has better standing in making its arguments if there is a derogatory statement made about the validity of the
9-dash line.
outline of the 9-dash line.
Okay.
That's the best they can hope for. from
But
this
does
whole
it help?
process.
Does it give them greater credibility? Does it give them
Yeah,
moral
well,
force?
it gives them greater credibility with me, because I have had the tribunal say they question the validity of the 9-dash line.
Okay, and so for ladies and gentlemen, for you in the audience, the 9-dash line that we've been talking about back and forth here is?
The 9-dash line is a line that was drawn up in 1947 by the old Kuomintang. So ironically, it's a line that was drawn by the old China, by the Republic of China, Taiwan, and it has been accepted by Beijing, the People's Republic of China, as the legitimate territorial claim in the South China Sea, and it runs basically from Taiwan south along the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, down to Indonesia, almost by Natuna Island, and then it sort of comes up to the west, northwest, up along the Vietnam coast, back up to Hainan Island, which is just in the southern part of China. And it basically encapsulates the entire South China Sea to the point where it comes within probably 80 miles of the Philippine coast, which is where Scarborough Shoal is located, and
Right.
And the tricky bit is it's called the 9-dash line because on the map it's drawn with 9 dashes. I mean, there's nothing. It's as obvious and literal a meaning as one could imagine.
Yeah. And it used to be 11-dash line, and in the 70s they negotiated with Vietnam to remove those 2 dashes and made it a actual boundary. But the 9 dashes are not fixed with latitude and longitude. They simply are lines on a map.
Interesting, interesting. Stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back after the break. We'll be talking more about the U.S. interests in the South China Sea and in the Eastern Sea Senkaku area. We are back. We are live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. This is Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights, and we're talking about the Senkaku Island disputes and the South China Sea with Mr. Brad Glosserman and Mr. Carl Baker of Pacific Forum.
Actually, you're mostly talking to Carl. I'm just asking questions.
Well, you're doing a very good job. You're making it easy for me, you know. But before we get back to our topic here, I'd like to bring on Jay Fidel from ThinkTech to talk about a development coming down the road that I think you all should know about. So here is Jay.
Thank you, David. You know, every month on the fourth Thursday of each month, the Hawaii Venture Capital Association and ThinkTech present a program at the Plaza Club. It's a luncheon program. It's usually a panel program, and on February 28th, the fourth Thursday in February, we're going to have a program on transportation. We call it Transportation in Hawaii. Can we still get around? So we're going to talk about all transportation modes. As you know, transportation is very important to the economy. With it, we can do a better economy. Without it, we can not do a better economy. We'll explore what parts of transportation in Hawaii are working and what parts of transportation in Hawaii are not working. That's February 28th. ThinkTech Hawaii and the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. You can sign up at hvca.org. See you then. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Jay. I'm just kind of curious, is there going to be a special section in that program having to do with potholes?
You know, there's no question we're going to cover potholes.
Okay, I'm just concerned. All right, let's get back to our discussion here on island disputes. And in the first segment of this show, we talked about the kind of the news developments, kind of where we are, this whole situation. And let's turn now to the point. What difference does it make to those of us in the U.S.? Why do we care? What are our interests in the region? And let's focus initially on the Senkaku Islands.
The perennial question of so what?
Yes, so what? Why do we care?
Carl?
Well, I mean,
Senkaku's first.
Senkaku's, well, I mean, just in general we care because it has to do with freedom of navigation. I mean, that's the primary U.S. interest in South China Sea, East China Sea, is being able to maintain free navigation in that part of the world. So I mean, that's sort of a basic given that the United States is concerned that it wants to be able to maintain access for both commercial and military vessels in that part of the world. So I think that's number one why we care about who owns what and how much access we have in that area. So that's number one. But number two, we care because our allies, Japan, and specifically the Philippines, are involved in the disputes over who owns that territory. So because they are involved, we have a mutual defense treaty with both countries. Okay. So we have some interest in how this gets resolved because we have a potential of becoming involved through them in the dispute.
In other words, if there's some type of military conflict breaks out between China and Japan through the Mutual Defense Assistance Treaty, Mutual Defense Treaty, what you're saying is the U.S. could potentially be sucked into that conflict.
Correct.
I mean, the issue isn't only, though, whether the United States is drawn into the conflict. The question is, it puts the question of U.S. commitment and credibility on the line. Insofar as our allies become engaged, the degree to which the United States is seen as both honoring its legal commitments in the form of the treaty, whether or not we send troops or whatever, but the degree to which we are there, backing them, speaks more broadly to the United States commitment, its readiness to honor its commitments to allies and to the region more generally. And so, you know, no matter that is a separate set of concerns, I think, which is the military question is both a subset of that and somewhat independent of it. You know, and one of the questions that we need to be thinking about as we proceed this, and there's actually two other broader questions at stake that I'd articulate in a minute. But that is a question of what are our allies expecting of us. I mean, we did 5 or 6 years ago, Pacific Forum gamed a scenario where there was a collision between Japanese and Chinese boats off the Senkakus, an accidental collision. And we had some of the really outstanding experts on Japan, some of the best guys in the country, former government officials playing Japan, prime minister, cabinet officers. We had them playing China. We had similar Chinese experts doing China. We had Americans faking it. Maybe it was just, you know, sort of like fantasy government camp for them. I don't know. But what we discovered was that the real danger was the question of what was expected and what we as Americans thought was considered to be a, you know, fulfilling our commitments to Japan, and what the Japanese thought. And there was a real clash there, a great gap. And when we thought we were experienced people that dealt with the United States, knew U.S. government procedures, and that dealt with Japan, nevertheless still managed to find there was a substantial gulf between what the Japanese were expecting us to do and what the Americans thought was the prudential and the right thing to do, and was at the same time fulfilling those obligations. So the way we manage our alliance relationships is really important, both for the relationships themselves and for the broader symbol and the signal that it sends
to other alliances.
To other alliances, to other countries that look to the United States as a partner.
Well, Brad, this example that you've given of the simulation that Pacific Forum did, or game, can you take us from that situation now? What are the Japanese people really expecting the U.S. to do in connection with our mutual defense treaty in the event something happens that triggers that in the Senkakus? What do they expect?
Well, that's a good question. You know, Ralph Koss, our president, and I, and a Japanese did a tour of Japan in late November and early December, which we've done now twice a year. And we go to 6 different cities over a course of a week, a program a day. We spoke to 200-300 people per program. And we were talking mostly about the impact of the election on our relationship. And needless to say, at every program, people were asking us about that. And it's clear that you don't know, because the Japanese were asking us to do more. And we would say, all right, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, all the relevant U.S. officials have said without question, the treaty applies under Article 5. It is territory administered. We will be with our ally. We will be there. You know, this falls under the ambit and the domain of the treaty. And they would then say, okay, but what else are you going to do? And then we would say, well, what else do you want us to do? That they couldn't answer. So it's always the questions of reassurance. And reassurance can be, tell me you love me again. And what have you done for me lately? Okay. And there's no good answer for that. It's atmospherics.
Carl?
Well, you know, Brad brings up the point that is what we said to Japan, because the Senkakus are administratively controlled by Japan, and so we have said that it does fall under the Mutual Defense Treaty, and that we will respond to provide assistance to Japan.
Is that why the dispute involving the Senkakus with China is perhaps more significant as opposed to?
Well, I think Carl's getting to that.
Yeah, I'm getting to that. You're anticipating it because the agreement with the Philippines does not say that we have an obligation. First of all, we don't have an obligation to come to their assistance. The Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines starts by saying we will consult in the event of an attack. So the treaty itself is weaker. But then beyond that, we do not recognize the Philippine claim to that territory because they do not administratively control the entire region. So the Spratlys in the South China Sea are contested territory, and our position on that is that we maintain a neutral stance on disputed territory. So we don't acknowledge any administrative control of the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea.
Which brings us back, and there's another point I wanted to finish up with in terms of the Japanese expectation. But I mean, the U.S. position is clear, at least if you think about it, and that is the United States takes no position on the legitimacy of any claim. The U.S. doesn't think that the Japanese claim is right or that the Chinese claim is wrong or vice versa in any territorial dispute. The question with the United States, as far as we're concerned, is the territory, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, are administered today by the Japanese. As such, that means they are, by definition, fall under the scope of the treaty, Article 5, because it specifically says territory is administered by Japan. So we make no judgment about the legitimacy of that claim, and so that's what gives it. That's what gives it force and what gives the United States credibility or gives the U.S. legitimacy. Now, the question, of course, is that the Japanese want us to say, they would say that's not enough, and oftentimes we want you to say that the Japanese claim is legitimate. And for all sorts of reasons we won't. But it occurs to me that, to go back to your original question, what is it they want? In some cases, I think they're uninformed, but nevertheless they are present. In some cases, the Japanese, I think, expect the Americans to do the fighting for them. That if there is and the arguments is that we don't have the capabilities, you're a better fighter force, et cetera, we don't, all sorts of reasons, some good, some not so. But nevertheless, we've made it in our conversations in Japan a few months ago, we made it perfectly clear. If the Japanese expectation is that their territories are invaded or threatened, and they expect the United States to do the fighting while the Japanese applaud from the sidelines, that's not going to happen. Our job is to support the Japanese, to make it possible for them to defend themselves. But the first obligation to defend Japan belongs to and is a burden upon the Japanese themselves.
And is that why we see proposals for increase in the defense budget in Japan?
Yes.
Concurrently.
Although it's a broader shift of updating the modernization of the Japanese defense forces.
We are back. We're live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at 808-296-5467. A little technical difficulty there. And the last segment of the program, we were talking about U.S. interests in the region. And Brad, you were in the middle of a discussion vis-a-vis China?
Actually, well, sort of. I thought that there are just two broad interests that are worth identifying and are slightly, may seem a little indistinct, but I think are important to recognize as well. In addition to this question of American credibility, the United States also has a powerful stake, I think, in seeing both the rule of law prevail. In other words, that we have a system of, arbitration, of procedures and rules that determine how we relate to each other.
Sure.
And I think we also have a stake in the peaceful resolution of disputes. And so ensuring that at the end of the day, and this is part of that first, but that when we have these disputes, we figure out a nice way to resolve them rather than resorting to force of arms.
Okay, well, let's turn now to a discussion. What's the motivation? What's behind all this dispute, these problems? Because there got to be some factors that our audience needs to know about. Why is this happening?
Well, to begin with, I think what's driving a lot of it is the fact that these countries are having to go further and further offshore for fish resources. I mean, fishing in each of these areas is great. I mean, there's submerged land, there's feeding areas for fish, and so the fisheries is a big piece of it. Is the search for protein. And as has happened in Hawaii here, where the fishing around the coastline has dried up a little bit, people are going further out, and so there's competition for that. Plus, of course, there's carbon deposits out there, so there's oil and gas deposits. We don't know how much. There's wild speculation of the numbers. I mean, it runs anywhere from 10 million to 100 billion barrels of oil and how much natural gas and all that. So there's a lot of unknown about that particular component. But a big part of the factor is a big part of of the competition is over resources that didn't exist before. Fishermen have been going out there for centuries. You know, and part of the historical claims that people have made is that fishermen from Japan, China, Philippines, Vietnam have been fishing those areas. So each country has a claim that they have exploited those resources in the past. The problem is that the competition is getting greater, and the space is shrinking as more people get out there to go fishing.
There's a larger, I think, an equally important element, which is the strategic question. For the Chinese looking at the South China Sea, for example, there's a concern that the South China Sea is a strategic basin, that there's a submarine fleet at Hainan Island that, in theory, will soon be carrying Chinese submarine-launched ballistic missiles, will be part of its modernization of its nuclear forces, and consequently will be the survivable part, or in theory, the survivable part of its nuclear arsenal in the event of a conflict, and consequently wanting to ensure that it has an area of its own, that it can send its subs out and be able to either get them to use them to launch. And I understand, Carl, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's a fairly shallow basin, so that there's concern about having the South China Sea and making sure that you can get further out into deeper waters.
Right.
So there's that, which is very much like the Russians with the Sea of Okhotsk during the Cold War. And I know you're a skeptic, but then
yeah, that's a real Japanese interpretation of South China Sea. I am very skeptical of that. I think that honestly that is not, that's a very much a constructed sort of argument that I'm not necessarily convinced.
We're talking about the motivation behind these disputes. So one area that we've talked about so far that you've identified is the resource issue. And but let's talk about nationalism.
Well, that's what I was going to get to that on a second, and I think this is a subset of that, is also this definition of this: the Chinese are becoming, acquiring greater capabilities to project their power further offshore and have further interests further afield from the Chinese mainland. That what you have is a chain of islands that largely, run along the Chinese coast, what they call the first island chain. And this becomes a device to safeguard, or at least to extend a little bit further Chinese territory, such that they can then project their power further out. And you will see, in theory, as a strategic concern, the Chinese moving further and further away as their capabilities progress. And that this is part of that process of expanding the Chinese sphere of influence and literal area which it controls.
Nationalism.
Yeah, that still doesn't. I don't think that gets at nationalism. With this whole strategic argument, I think there's the business about first island chain and second island chain, and eventually China's going to control the world, and all that. I accept that, but I think that the real issue for the countries involved is that it has become a nationalist, an issue of nationalism, because as people. As leaders continue to stake their claims, what happens is they feed it back into the population and make it a sovereignty issue for each one of the countries. And so, specifically in China, they have said repeatedly that this is historic absolute sovereignty over these areas, and that there's no compromise, and that they've made it an issue with the people that any compromise is going to look like a problem for Chinese nationalism. And the same has happened, I think, in Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam.
Where's that not the case? I'm not disputing you, but I'm trying to think of in any case where any country has willingly said, yeah, it's our territory, we'll give it to you, it's okay.
Yeah, but I think it's just a question. I mean, it's a question of how do you deal with the issue. I mean, United States and Canada has had a territorial dispute up in the Washington-Vancouver area for a long time, but we don't really talk about it, and we don't make it a big issue between the two countries. And so I think that the nationalism issue comes into play when you do make a big issue of it, when there is constant reminders that this is our sovereign territory, and that sovereignty is being infringed on by other countries in the region.
But then that begs the question, of the broader political dynamics in China, which is cause and effect. And I mean, why? Because this has been a dispute this territory has been disputed for 1947, as you would say.
Well, it's been disputed
for
when
hundreds
you
of
go
years.
back further than that.
The argument that the Chinese have made, or that the Japanese and many of the Southeast Asians have made, is that China has only recently begun to evince any interest in this. That, you know, back when Zhou Enlai started to meet with Tanaka Kakue, et cetera, that it was always, we will put this off until generations smarter than us can pick this up. And the claim by the Chinese, the ex-Chinese disputants, if you will, is the Chinese interest is driven by energy resources now.
Yeah. Well, and you know, another perverse fact is that the requirement in UNCLOS to establish baselines has also served to exacerbate the problem and create the conditions that allow for more nationalism, because each country has the requirement to establish its coastal baseline. And to do that, you have to establish where the continental shelf is. And so in the process of doing that, of course, that's when the overlapping claims became more evident to all the parties, because the continental shelf claim extends out for China, extends out to the Diaoyutai. And so there you have, you know, suddenly China putting it in the face of Japan, saying this is our territory based on the baseline that we're establishing for our coast.
So and you had a deadline of what, last December to file the baseline claims.
Actually, it was
correct?
2009.
Okay,
So what you were saying, Carl, is that the UNCLOS deadline actually serves as to flush out a lot of these disputes and.
Yeah. So even though UNCLOS was meant to solve some of the problems of how do you determine maritime
it's exacerbated the situation.
It's exacerbated the situation because it's forced people to put in writing their claims.
So it's forced it out of the realm of this squishy diplomacy and into the sharp, pointy stick of the lawyers.
Yeah, and so suddenly we got a bunch of lawyers involved.
There we go. There we go. That'll do it every time. When China ratified the UNCLOS, did they do so with some interesting reservations?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, the only one I know.
Big caveats?
Not like China did, saying we don't.
Said China.
I said China.
Oh, China. Oh, I thought you said Japan. I'm sorry. Well, yeah. I mean, with the caveat saying we don't accept the procedures for tribunals. We don't. There's really three things that they don't accept, and they are they don't accept delimitation of the territorial sea, delimitation of the exclusive economic zones, and delimitation of the continental shelf. So basically, all those features talking about coastal baselines, they don't accept.
They've just gutted the whole thing.
Yeah.
Well,
well, certainly the parts that matter to the other countries in the region.
but let's also be clear: the United States has not signed the UNCLOS either. So, you know, our kibitzing, if you will, and disparaging the Chinese for carving out their exceptions, I suppose at least they've got some ground to stand on, or feature, or is it an island?
It's a rock.
Did the two of you think that the United States should sign the
Absolutely.
UNCLOS?
Oh,
Absolutely.
I think absolutely. We hurt ourselves so badly by not being a signatory
Why?
to UNCLOS.
But I mean, the Pentagon's actually said now, has decided that it wants to, that it's a constituency for this.
And remember that we in fact submitted that to Congress last year. The Secretary of State Clinton actually submitted it to Congress last year, and it didn't go anywhere. And the reason why we should sign UNCLOS is because we really have no big objections. We adhere to UNCLOS. In any statement we make about maritime space, we caveat it by saying we do accept all of UNCLOS. We just haven't ratified it, and so it helps us. It gives us credibility. And when we come back from the break, we'll talk a little bit more about what else can be done to resolve these disputes. But a starting point is that if we're a signatory to UNCLOS, then we can at least use UNCLOS as a starting point for trying to find ways to resolve the dispute.
Boy, this is fascinating. Stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back after the break. We're back. We're live. And we're talking about the South China Sea and the Senkaku Islands disputes. The heat is on, and it looks like it's going to stay on here. We're talking with Carl Baker and Brad Glosserman of Pacific Forum, and we've been kind of marching through a series of questions and analyses on various topics relating to these disputes. And in this final section of the program, what we want to do is talk a little bit about kind of where do we go from here, or is there a way to resolve this whole thing? And right before the break, we were talking about the importance of the United States ratification, assent to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea as the beginning tool that could be used in some possible unraveling discussions. Do I have that about right, Brad, or no?
That's probably about right. I mean, I think one of the, you asked us why we haven't done it because it's so clearly in our interest. Part of the problem is, at this moment, no treaty gets through the U.S. Senate. It's just, it is impossible to get a majority that would favor anything that restricts exercise of U.S. power and privilege in the world. It's an unfortunate situation because clearly a treaty like this, I think if you look at the people that are behind it, very, very staunchly, powerfully in favor of it, and yet you have a political and obstructionism among the other politicians in the Senate that basically just say, there's nothing that we will agree to.
Okay, well, let's go to the big question. Is there a way to resolve these island disputes that you see?
First of all, I think you have to recognize that there's no single way to resolve all the disputes. They're all discrete. They all have particular factors behind them, and so they've all got to be handled individually. My reading of the Senkakus at this moment is that it's going to be very difficult. The Chinese have decided that they wish to change the status quo, that they wish to assert administrative control, and they have been slowly bumping up their level of interaction such that, first it was sending ships in there, now they've got ships and planes, in a way though that suggests that they're there permanently, that they are controlling parts of this. And so actually raising legalistic, practical questions about the degree to which the Japanese control these islands. And having done that, you alter the status quo, and you then create a legal question where one did not exist previously. And so my sense is that the Chinese have done this primarily because they have, I think they've sensed opportunity and they've sensed weakness in Tokyo, an inability on Japan's part to respond effectively, a feeling of distraction, weakness is the crude way to put it. And they're going to keep pushing until they get the Japanese government to make that acknowledgement that Japan does not have control solely, and consequently there is in fact a legal dispute here. And that
so they're driving for a joint administrative.
They just want the recognition on the part of the Japanese that the Chinese have a legal claim. And they're not going to assert it. The idea that the Chinese are going to send forces in, grab the islands, that's not going to happen. But there is a chance that you have a mishap, that plane bumps plane, right, ship bumps ship, that people die. They have died in the past. But what will happen is that they want a legal statement from the Japanese government that legitimates the Chinese claim to the islands. And I don't know how I wrote 6 months ago in a piece that it looks to me as though all of the Japanese have tried to explain why they behaved the way they have, and the Chinese have not accepted it. And they continue to up the ante. And the Japanese have been responding to that. And consequently, in the absence of a Chinese decision to scale back and to quit pushing, if you will, or which only would come, I think, at the end of the day if the Japanese say, okay, then we have a problem. And a concession of that sort, I think, by Japan would be problematic, because if nothing else, it would just encourage similar behavior by China elsewhere.
What do you think, Carl?
Well, what China has said is that we're not the ones changing the status quo. Japan is the one that's changing the status quo because Japan nationalized the islands last year. Because remember, prior to that, these islands were actually owned by an individual. And what happened was the national government purchased 3 of the islands from that individual.
This is Governor Ishihara?
Well, that's how it started. It started with the Tokyo governor, the governor of Tokyo, threatening to buy it. And the national government said, well, a better solution is for the national government to buy it. But China interpreted that as changing the status quo.
Oh, okay.
So there's both sides claiming the other side is changing the status quo. I mean, but the fact is that it has been disputed, and although China has said it doesn't accept the UNCLOS determination on continental shelf. In fact, what it has recently done is it has made its own claim that the continental shelf extends to that part of the ocean. So it does try to make its claim through UNCLOS, through international law, as well as through assertion of administrative control. So basically what is happening in the Senkakus is that both sides are trying to demonstrate that they have control by sending patrol vessels out there to demonstrate that claim.
I mean, what we also have is a difference between the political meaning of a dispute, which is two countries actually having legal claims validated, accepted by the other, and the every ordinary day usage of the word dispute. Because everybody would say that in the way that you and I use the word dispute, that there is a dispute over the Senkakus. The Chinese claim it and the Japanese claim it. What the Japanese are saying is that though in the highfalutin language of the lawyers and diplomats, that there isn't a claim such that rises to the level of legal status. And the Chinese are saying we are trying to establish that. And consequently, so that's different. That's why in so many cases when the Japanese say, but there isn't a dispute, it sounds so patently silly when in fact every day the headlines are precisely about that.
Yeah, but that's right. Japan says there is no legal dispute because we have administrative control, and that's what China is trying to do, is demonstrate that they do through both legal means, that is UNCLOS, and physical presence of ships.
But
and,
you know,
and
gentlemen, the
surveillance
question
vessels.
that's on the table is, can this dispute as between China and Japan over the Senkakus, can it be resolved?
Sure, of course it can. And that is, you have to make a political, just as it was decided in 1972 to put it off for later generations, you need a political decision among the leaderships of the two parties to come up with a face-saving claim that allows them both to claim victory and then shelve the thing such that they focus on doing other things. But that requires political will, and because of the nationalism issues that Carl had talked about. And frankly, you know, the timing of this could not be worse, insofar as it's happened in the middle of a political election in Japan. It's happened in the middle of a political transition in China. And in neither of those instances does anybody counseling, let's just be calm and let's just be responsible and compromise. That doesn't win you a lot of votes.
So what you're saying, Brad, is a practical matter. There isn't going to be a resolution in the short term.
I don't think so. And there is one more very, again, functional little thing that I think has to be mentioned. In theory, I mean, not in theory, Chinese President Hu Jintao met Japanese Prime Minister Noda, then Japanese Prime Minister Noda, in September in Vladivostok. They had a meeting on the side of the APEC discussion where supposedly this came up. And by all accounts, Noda came away thinking he had an understanding with Hu about what the Japanese were doing and the Chinese would understand it. And clearly that is not the case. So we need to know what precisely transpired. I mean, we historians at some point need to know what transpired at that meeting. What was the actual give and take? What was agreed, if anything? And to what degree did the Japanese act? I mean, at the end, what you can easily say is that there's clearly been a failure of imagination on the part of Japanese diplomats in the way they've handled this. There were probably intermediate steps between letting Ishihara buy the islands and do what he wanted specifically to rile up the Japanese or the Chinese, versus the nationalization, which the Japanese government thought was the lesser of two evils. There could have been the purchase, you know, why couldn't they have just sort of come up with legal issues why the sale couldn't go through? Why couldn't they have turned it into an environmental area, you know, a peace park? I mean, there are other, I think, creative solutions that would have sidestepped this question of the assertion of national control, which so irritated the Chinese and for them broke the status quo. What's going to be very interesting in the postmortems that I hope the Foreign Ministry and the Cabinet Office are doing in Tokyo is understanding where the failures of Japanese diplomacy took place.
We have time for one more question, and that is, what do you think? Has China passed the point of no return?
Well,
not able to back down on this issue now?
Oh no, I think they can back down. I think that there's a resolution. You know, Ma Ying-jeou from Taiwan has in fact proposed a solution where they would do joint exploration and joint patrol, and I think that that's probably where resolution in East China Sea lies, is some sort of joint recognition of each other's claims, and then probably some sort of joint patrols.
Let me get a quick comment from both of you. What do you think the impact is on the Southeast Asian countries on the way that China's been pushing?
Yeah, what we haven't talked about is South China Sea, because South China Sea is a little bit different. There, I think that there's a better chance of finding a solution, at least in terms of ASEAN coming up with a code of conduct for behavior in that region. And so I think that ASEAN is on its way to developing some sort of code of conduct, which would limit interaction between ships in the region and would put pressure on China to comply with that code of conduct. And so it would make it more difficult for China to block off access to places like Scarborough Shoal and things like that, because the territory there there's actual occupation of those islands. Remember, in the Senkakus, there's nobody that lives on those places.
There's goats.
But in South China Sea, each country has placed structures or some kind of military contingent there.
That's all we have for today. Thank you for joining us. Have a safe drive home, and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.